Picture this. You are on a wooden warship in 16th century Japan. The sea stretches in every direction. You have been rowing for 2 days. Your mouth is dry, your throat is raw, and the wooden barrel lashed to the hull is already half empty. There is no river nearby. No well. No rain in the forecast. What do you do? Today we are going to answer that question, and the answer is far more fascinating than you might expect. Before we get into the solutions, let us understand the scale of the problem. The human body can survive roughly 3 days without water. On land, that is manageable. At sea, surrounded by salt water you cannot drink, in the heat of a Japanese summer, rowing hard against a coastal current, 3 days becomes an urgent countdown. Feudal Japanese sailors faced this reality on every voyage they took. And these were not gentle outings. The seas around the Japanese archipelago are among the most demanding in Asia. The Pacific coast is exposed to powerful currents and unpredictable weather. The Seto Inland Sea, while more sheltered, is a maze of tides, islands, and narrow channels that require constant navigation. The Sea of Japan to the west carries fierce winter storms that could pin a fleet in harbor for weeks. Every voyage carried genuine risk, and water management was at the center of all of it. To understand how sailors survived, you first need to understand the ships they sailed on. The most powerful warship in feudal Japan was the Atakebune. Massive, flat-bottomed, and heavily armored, the Atakebune was essentially a floating fortress. Some versions were large enough to carry hundreds of soldiers, archers, and crew. They were intimidating vessels, designed to dominate coastal waters through sheer size and firepower. But here is the thing about the Atakebune that matters for our story today. It was not built for the open ocean. Its flat hull made it stable in sheltered waters but dangerously vulnerable to heavy swells. This was by design, not by accident. Japanese naval doctrine in the feudal period was fundamentally coastal. The goal was to control the sea lanes between islands, to blockade ports, to support land forces moving along the shore. You did not need to cross the Pacific to do that. You needed to dominate the coastline, and the Atakebune was built to do exactly that. This coastal focus had a direct and crucial implication for water supply. Because voyages rarely took ships far from land, and because the Japanese archipelago is long and narrow with freshwater rivers and harbors at regular intervals, sailors almost always had access to resupply points within a day or two of sailing. The architecture of the ship and the strategy of the navy worked together to keep the water problem manageable. Not easy. Manageable. No discussion of feudal Japanese naval warfare is complete without Kuki Yoshitoka, the most celebrated naval commander of the Sengo period. Serving under the warlord Oda Nobunaga, Kuki built and commanded the first ironclad warships in Japanese history during the late 16th century, reinforced vessels that were virtually immune to the fire attacks that had dominated naval combat up to that point. What made Kuki remarkable as a commander was not just his engineering instincts but his logistical intelligence. He understood, better than almost anyone of his era, that a fleet which runs out of water loses before a single arrow is fired. His naval campaigns along the Kii Peninsula and through the Seto Inland Sea were characterized by careful planning of resupply routes, controlled use of harbors, and a deep awareness of how long his ships could operate before needing to come to shore. When Kuki planned a blockade, he was not just thinking about where to position his ships for maximum military effect. He was thinking about which harbors his fleet could access, which rivers could be reached quickly, and how many days of water each vessel was carrying. Water management was not a logistical footnote. It was a strategic calculation at the heart of every campaign he ran. So how did the water actually get onto the ship, and how was it kept? The primary storage method was wooden barrels, sealed with lacquer or pine resin on the interior to reduce leakage and slow contamination. These barrels were typically made from cedar or cypress, both of which have natural antimicrobial properties that helped slow the growth of algae and bacteria in stored water. The barrels were filled at port from the freshest available source, usually a river or a well away from the harbor itself, where saltwater intrusion was less likely. They were then lashed securely below deck or in the hold, where they would stay cool and out of direct sunlight. Heat accelerates the growth of everything you do not want in your drinking water, so keeping barrels shaded and cool was not just comfort. It was the difference between water that was drinkable on day 5 and water that was not. Even with the best storage, water in wooden barrels degraded over time. The wood itself could impart flavor and sometimes harbor bacteria even with lacquer coating. After 3 or 4 days in warm conditions, stored water could become brackish, sour-smelling, and potentially dangerous. Sailors knew this. The barrels were not a solution to the water problem. They were the first line of defense, and everyone on board understood they had a finite lifespan. Which brings us to water rationing, which on a feudal Japanese vessel was not informal. It was structured, enforced, and taken seriously as a matter of survival. Each sailor received a fixed daily ration, typically measured in small wooden cups, and consuming more than your allocation without permission was a serious offense. The senior crew managed the barrels and controlled distribution. Nobody simply helped themselves. The ration amount depended on conditions. In cooler weather or on a short coastal run, the daily allowance might be relatively generous. In summer heat, or when a voyage had been extended by bad weather, rations were cut. Sailors learned to function on less water than they would choose to drink on land, supplementing hydration through food and through drinks that did not rely on pure fresh water. This discipline was not unique to Japan. Maritime cultures around the world understood rationing as the foundation of survival at sea. But the Japanese approach had particular cultural weight behind it. The concept of gaman, the capacity to endure hardship without complaint, was deeply embedded in the samurai class that commanded these vessels, and it filtered down to the crews who served on them. Suffering quietly through thirst was not just pragmatic. It was expected. Here is where feudal Japanese sailors had a genuine advantage over their European counterparts of the same era. Japan had a sophisticated food and drink culture built around fermentation, preservation, and the transformation of basic ingredients into things that lasted longer and traveled better than their raw forms. That culture translated directly to life at sea. Mugicha, roasted barley tea, was one of the most common drinks on Japanese ships. It was prepared by boiling barley in water, which served a dual purpose. The boiling killed pathogens in water that might already be slightly compromised from barrel storage, and the resulting drink was flavorful, mildly stimulating, and importantly, did not require the same quality of input water as drinking it straight. Slightly stale barrel water that would be unpleasant to drink plain became perfectly acceptable mugicha. Umeboshi, the intensely sour and salty pickled plum, was another staple of the Japanese sailors' supplies. It was not a drink, but it addressed the hydration problem from a different angle. The salt in umeboshi stimulated saliva production and helped sailors feel less immediately thirsty. The sourness encouraged slower, more deliberate eating rather than desperate consumption. A single umeboshi eaten slowly alongside a small ration of water made that ration feel like considerably more. There is also evidence that diluted rice wine and fermented grain drinks were carried on longer voyages, particularly for officers and higher-ranking crew. Alcohol in small quantities does not hydrate, but it can reduce the psychological discomfort of thirst and carries caloric value that helps the body cope with physical stress. Sailors across all cultures have understood this intuitively for as long as there have been ships and fermentation. Japanese sailors were no different. Japan receives significant rainfall throughout the year, and sailors on the Seto Inland Sea and along the Pacific coast learn to treat rain not as an inconvenience but as a resupply opportunity. When rain came, anything that could collect water was put to use. Sails were angled to channel runoff into barrels. Tarpaulins were stretched to create collection surfaces. Pots and bowls were set out across the deck. This opportunistic harvesting could meaningfully extend a voyage that might otherwise have been cut short. A good rain event over a few hours could refill barrels that had been running low and buy the fleet another 2 or 3 days of range. Captains who understood weather patterns along their regular routes knew when to expect rain and could plan accordingly, factoring likely precipitation into their water calculations the same way a modern navigator factors fuel consumption. Pull back and look at the bigger picture, and a pattern becomes clear. Almost every element of how feudal Japanese sailors managed water points back to the same fundamental strategic choice: stay close to land. The Atakebune was built for coastal waters. Kuki Yoshitoka planned his campaigns around harbor access. Rations were calculated for voyages measured in days, not weeks. Rain collection worked because Japan is a wet archipelago with coastline rarely far away. The sailors who served on those ships were not surviving in spite of the constraints they worked within. They were thriving because of the sophistication with which they had learned to work within them. Every rationed cup of water, every barrel of mugicha, Every pickled plum, every sail angled toward falling rain was an expression of accumulated maritime knowledge, passed down through generations of men who had made the waters around Japan their home. So, what strikes you, looking at all of this together, is how much of survival at sea has nothing to do with the sea itself. It is about knowledge, about discipline, about the hundreds of small decisions made before the ship ever leaves the harbor. The feudal Japanese sailor who survived a 2-week campaign along the Kii Peninsula did not survive by luck. He survived because someone had filled the barrels carefully, because his captain had planned the route around reliable water sources, because the culture he came from had taught him to endure and adapt rather than panic and consume. These were not extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. They were ordinary people who had been trained to think clearly about a very specific and very serious problem. And they solved it, voyage after voyage, for over 300 years of feudal naval history. If there is a question you want answered about feudal Japan, drop it in the comments. This world has more depth than almost any history we cover on this channel, and we are only just getting started. So, if this kind of history is your thing, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week we go deep on the stories from the past that most people have never heard told properly. See you in the next one.